All right, so today we're going to be talking about a recent interview that John Mayer did where he discussed the Universal Audio Amp Simulator pedals in the context of Dead & Company and the Sphere, because the way the Sphere is designed, the stage is meant to be as silent as possible, so having an amp on stage making a lot of noise just isn't really feasible the way that venue is designed. I don't totally understand why that is for a venue that's housed for, for musicians and for people to play gigs and do residencies like this. It kind of doesn't lend itself to making it the easiest thing. Hence why the Edge, when U2 kind of kicked off the Sphere's opening with the residency, the Edge actually went and switched to 3 specific Universal Audio Amp Simulator pedals, the Ruby, the Woodrow, and the Dream, which in the context of the Edge's sound makes a lot of sense. You have an AC30 style, a Tweed style, and then a Blackface Fender style as well, which the Edge is known to be using. All kind of 3 of those amps, mainly an AC30 and Tweed amps together is kind of his main tonal sounds, but because he couldn't have actual amps, which normally for him would be running underneath the stage mic'd up, he couldn't do that. He just switched to the Universal Audio pedals and just kind of called it a day, which then leads to a band like Dead & Company when they're doing their residency. Why haven't they done the same? Now, the following is a piece from the interview that both John Mayer and Bob Weir did with Guitar World for May 2025. Titled Dead & Company right on the front there. This magazine article is going to be linked in the description down below. I highly suggest you guys go and check it out. It's got lots of great bits of information in it. The interview as a whole is absolutely fantastic. It's a must-have for any Mayer fan, any Dead & Company fan. So go and check out the full magazine down below. It'll be the first link in the description. But I'm just taking a small piece from this interview because it's pretty key in terms of John's thoughts with these pedals and the context of the Sphere, and also a little bit interesting to hear Bob Weir chime in on the exact same thing and how he actually ended up going a different approach than what Mayer is currently doing. So the question goes, John, you actually still had tube amps on stage with you during the first run at Sphere, and John mentions, I grew up playing with tube amps. He grew up feeling the combustion of an amplifier. I really like the UA Enigmatic 82 Overdrive Special Amp pedal, Universal Audio's new Dumble amp simulator pedal. And John says, I think if you're a young guitar player, that's money well spent, but my style of playing relies on a certain amount of pushback. I need shocks on the tires, and I think that can only come from the ignition inside a tube amplifier. So right there, John kind of clarifies that in terms of amp simulator pedals, obviously he's been either experimenting with or maybe just practicing at home with the UA Enigmatic, but it's not something that he's really willing to dive into, at least at this point in his career, which, like we've just mentioned, the Edge kind of just with the use and everything, the way they set it up, went in a completely different direction. But it kind of makes sense for John. His amp setup, I feel like, is a little bit more complicated, and he's very set in the nuances between these vintage Fenders, between these Two Rocks, between these Dumbles. You just won't quite get that from using something like the Enigmatic from, obviously my understanding of it. But it's huge props to Universal Audio because I think the products that they've come out with right now are the closest things really to getting that feeling and that sound that we've ever had. I think that whole line of amp simulator pedals are absolutely brilliant. And even hear from John, he really likes the Dumble version. But for him, if he's going to play a gig at Sphere, he's just going to go with doing something else in order to actually make the rig work the way he wants to and to get that feeling underneath his fingers of playing a real tube amplifier. Now, the interview does go on to bring up the video that John had posted during the 2024 residency at the Sphere where they had those big shipping containers in the loading docks, and you could hear John's guitar coming from those, and they were mic'd up inside of there as just a really genius workaround to the whole kind of Sphere, the way the Sphere works in terms of, you need that stage to be silent. John kind of goes on to discuss the things, and I'm not going to read from his whole, quote or anything, just the part that I want to kind of take out in terms of the context of at least this video. And he just kind of talks about how the pushing air debate is a thing that he really does believe in. So he had to devise a system that would give a little more space to the speakers. And what they decided to do was use those shipping crates as much as, essentially large ISO boxes, kind of like a mini room. And he gives credit again to Jeremy, his guitar tech, about how he kind of came up with the design and even decorated them to kind of mimic a small studio, which is so cool. And then how it also added a different dimension to what he was playing. And there was a little bit of extra space for the notes to grow, he says, just by virtue of them being in these larger ISO boxes, essentially. So his amps were on stage, but the speakers were in these boxes on the loading docks of the Sphere. So that's kind of, touching on that whole concept and what he did to get around it. And in the interview as well, John just does confirm that the amps that you see him with on stage are in fact the amps that you are hearing. So those amps are running all the way to the loading dock, and then, they're mic'd up and then brought back to the PA in front of house, and, kind of everything and how that works. He does kind of joke almost and mentions that having cabs, at least on stage, it's there to help raise the heads of the amps so he can reach them with his hand instead of having to really bend over to adjust things on the fly if he wanted to, or if they, if Jeremy needed to come and work on them or whatever. So that's kind of really the reasoning as to why the cabs are on stage. They're actually just bolstered up to kind of make them not just sitting on the ground, which, it does make sense. I absolutely love this interview because they ask a lot of the right questions and kind of prompting John to, discuss a little bit more in depth as to their workaround around the silent stageness of the Sphere. And even from that, you can kind of take in the fact that they probably did think about using some of those universal audio pedals maybe to come up with their sounds, but John just elected to go with a more traditional amp setup in a really amazing way to get around it, because obviously with the Edge, he was kind of the guinea pig for it. He was the one who sorted out, okay, let's just use this. It's still going to sound great. That just always sounds great, and it'll work perfect and just make things a lot easier. But they didn't go down that route. But the other part I want to bring up that I think is relevant to this conversation is Bob Weir's portion of the interview, because they kind of go and ask him the exact same question. They mention that other guitarists who've performed at Sphere, like the Edge and Phish's Trey Anastasio, have noted that the venue's unique design makes it challenging and also somewhat unnecessary to use traditional amps on stage. The Edge in particular mentioned switching from tube amps to universal audio amps and pedals for his setup. Going basically with the exact same question of Bob Weir, but how he went about doing it. And Weir does clarify, well, at first I had all this stuff with me, an ISO chamber with a guitar amp in it, all of that, but very quickly I was just done with it. It was just not necessary. Instead, I've been using the Universal Audio Ruby, which is basically a Vox AC30 in a stomp box. I couldn't have imagined when I first walked in there that that was going to be pretty much all I need. It turns out it was pretty much all I needed, and he, jokes about that as well. And they go into a lot more detail about his rig and other things in this interview. Like I said, I'm just pulling out the pieces that are very relevant to this topic and conversation. Go and check out the full article. It's linked in the description down below. Definitely worth it. What's really cool about this, though, is how when we saw kind of John and Jeremy and everyone kind of tease what they were doing the first go around at the Sphere, you saw there was one ISO cab, one of these big boxes in the loading dock of the Sphere, with a hand-wired AC30 in it, which definitely appeared to be Bob Weir's, and I still believe it was Bob's because John appears to be using a newer hand-wired AC30 for one of his external speaker cabs. I don't know. It's a little bit weird, John using an AC30, but this one that we'd seen before last year, I still believe was Bob Weir's, and was basically the kick at the first kick at the cat almost of it, where he mentions, at first I had all this stuff with me, an ISO chamber with a guitar amp in it, all of that. So I'm assuming that's what Bob Weir's was, and John just had one going on. Now, for the second residency, John just took over the one that was originally designed for Bob. They probably only had one each, and now John has two this time around. But Bob Weir is using the Ruby, which kind of, goes in line with, I think, what a lot of people are going to be doing when it comes to the Sphere. The universal audio pedals are certainly more than good enough to get you by and to give you some great sounds for that venue without having to go just overly complicated like John and Jeremy are. So there you guys go. I just wanted to touch on this because it's very relevant to the whole conversation of the Sphere and how John is getting his tones. And I thought the part about Bob Weir actually just moving on to the Universal Audio Ruby was worth discussing as well. So, definitely, I'm sure they had that conversation with John, but he was like, no, we're going to keep doing this, and I think it's awesome. And you know what the heck? It's one of the many things, I think all of us guitar players, gearheads love about John is, he's almost a bit stubborn in that way, but I think it's absolutely brilliant. So like I've said, go check out this Guitar World magazine, the entire interview between Bob and John. It's fantastic. I really recommend going out and purchasing it yourselves to review and stuff like that. And that's why I'm not sharing screenshots or anything from the actual magazine. I'm just kind of quoting and paraphrasing from the interview because I don't want to share like whole pages or anything with you guys, just out of respect for Guitar World. There's one other piece that they mentioned in this interview that I do think is cool. So I think I might make one more video just discussing John's amp rig as a whole and some of the context, because he does confirm one specific part that we never actually had confirmed until now. So I'll make a separate video discussing that little tidbit in kind of one line from this interview that I'll, expand on as always. But I just thought this was definitely worth talking about. And yeah, kudos to John and Jeremy for, going the extra mile and designing these things, because it's absolutely wild. Hopefully we get some more information though as to why John is using a Tweed amp and an AC30 as external speaker cabinets. I just would have assumed another Dumble, 212, 412, a couple more 2-rock ones maybe. I don't know. It seems weird, but maybe we'll find out at some point. So hope you guys enjoyed today's video. Stay tuned for more coverage of Dead & Company at the Sphere in 2025. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.
Anyway, go ahead and click the subscribe button if you like what you see.